The morning light slipped through the blinds of a quiet physical therapy clinic in Oregon, painting soft, golden lines across the floor. The room was calm, almost peaceful, with the faint scent of clean linen and herbal oil lingering in the air. Most people walking past would never guess that inside this small clinic, lives were quietly changing in ways that felt almost miraculous to the people experiencing them. At the center of it all was a woman in her early 60s named Margaret. She had once been active, independent, and full of energy. She used to take long walks with her husband, bake cookies for her grandchildren, and tend to her garden with pride. But over the past few years, something had changed. Her legs had started to feel heavy. Her arms would swell slightly by the evening. Even simple tasks like folding laundry or standing in the kitchen for too long left her exhausted in a way she could not explain. Doctors had given her a word for it: lymphedema. But hearing the name didn't make it easier to live with. What she felt was not just swelling, it was frustration, fear, and a quiet sadness that she could not do the things she once loved without discomfort. On this particular morning, Margaret sat in a chair in the clinic, holding her hands tightly together. She was waiting for someone she had been referred to by a friend, someone who was known not just for treatment, but for teaching people how to help their own bodies heal gently and naturally. Her name was Daniel Reed, a licensed physical therapist who had spent over 20 years working with patients struggling with lymphatic issues, post-surgical swelling, and chronic inflammation. Unlike many clinicians who relied only on machines or medications, Daniel believed in something simpler: helping the body remember how to help itself. When he entered the room, he didn't rush. He greeted Margaret with a calm smile, as if he had all the time in the world. "Good morning," he said gently. "I'm glad you came in today." Margaret gave a small nod. "I'm not sure anything will really help anymore," she admitted honestly. "I've tried so many things." Daniel pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "That's exactly why I wanted to show you something different," he replied. "Something your body already knows how to respond to." Margaret looked confused. "My body knows what to do?" He nodded. "Yes. Your lymphatic system is always working, even now, but sometimes it needs a little help moving things along." He paused for a moment, then reached for a soft, natural bristle brush from a small table beside him. It looked simple, almost too simple to matter. "This," he said, holding it up, "is called dry brushing." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "A brush?" Daniel smiled. "Yes, but not just any brush. When used correctly, it can gently support lymphatic flow, improve circulation, and help reduce that heavy, stuck feeling you've been experiencing." Margaret wasn't convinced yet. "So, you're telling me this little brush can fix something doctors haven't been able to fix?" Daniel didn't rush to answer. He understood this reaction well. Many of his patients had been disappointed too many times before. "It doesn't fix everything," he said honestly, "but it can support your body in a way that feels surprisingly powerful when done consistently and gently." He leaned forward slightly. "Would you be willing to learn how it feels?" Margaret hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. What she didn't know in that moment was that this simple decision would begin a journey that would change the way she understood her own body forever. Daniel began by explaining something that most people had never really been taught. The lymphatic system, he said, is like a hidden drainage network in the body. It helps remove waste, supports immunity, and keeps fluids balanced. Unlike the heart, it doesn't have a pump. It relies on movement, breathing, and gentle pressure from muscles and skin to keep things flowing. When we become less active, he explained, or when the system is under stress, fluid can build up. That's when people start feeling swelling, heaviness, or stiffness. Margaret listened carefully. For the first time, her condition was being explained in a way that didn't make her feel broken. Instead, it made her feel like something had simply become stuck. Daniel stood up and demonstrated slowly. Dry brushing is about encouraging movement on the surface of the skin. We always move in gentle strokes toward the heart, following the natural pathways of lymph flow. He showed her how to start at the feet, brushing upward in soft, steady motions. Not hard, not aggressive, just rhythmic and calm. Then he moved up the legs, always directing the strokes inward and upward. "It should never hurt," he reminded her. "If it feels uncomfortable, you're pressing too hard. This is about support, not force." Margaret watched closely, her skepticism slowly shifting into curiosity. Then Daniel handed her the brush. "Try it," he said quietly. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it. At first, she barely touched her skin. The sensation was new, almost unfamiliar. But as she continued, something subtle began to change. It wasn't dramatic. There was no instant miracle, but she noticed a warmth spreading through her skin, a light, tingling sensation that felt strangely soothing. "It feels different," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "That's your body responding." For the first time in months, Margaret felt like she was participating in her own healing instead of just waiting for it to happen. Over the next few weeks, Margaret began to practice dry brushing each morning before her shower. At first, she was inconsistent. Some days she forgot. Some days she doubted it was doing anything at all. But Daniel had told her something important that stayed in her mind. The body responds to repetition, not perfection. So she continued. Slowly, small changes began to appear. Her legs felt less heavy in the mornings. The tightness in her arms was slightly reduced. She noticed she was walking a bit longer without needing to rest. These changes were not dramatic enough for others to notice, but for Margaret, they were everything. One afternoon, she returned to the clinic for a follow-up. When Daniel saw her, he noticed it immediately, not just in her posture, but in her expression. "You look lighter," he said. Margaret smiled for the first time in a long while. "I didn't believe it at first," she admitted, "but something is changing." Daniel nodded. "Your body is remembering how to move fluid again." She sat down, more relaxed this time. "I wish I had known about this earlier." Daniel looked thoughtful. Most people don't realize how powerful gentle daily habits can be. We tend to look for big solutions, but sometimes the smallest consistent actions make the biggest difference. He paused. "But there's something else I want to show you today." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "This is important," he continued. "Dry brushing works best when combined with breathing and movement." He guided her through a simple practice: slow, deep breaths, gentle stretching, light walking, all of it designed to support circulation and lymph flow naturally. Margaret realized something in that moment. This wasn't just about a brush, it was about teaching the body to feel alive again. As the weeks turned into months, Margaret's routine became a quiet ritual. Each morning, she would stand in her bathroom, the world still silent outside, and gently brush her skin with care. It was no longer strange to her. It was comforting. She began to notice something even deeper than physical change. Her mood improved. Her energy returned slowly. She felt more connected to her body instead of fighting against it. One morning, while preparing breakfast, her granddaughter visited unexpectedly. The young girl ran into the kitchen and hugged her tightly. Margaret froze for a second. This used to hurt. But this time she felt only a mild sensation, not pain, just life. Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled. Later that day, she told Daniel about it during another session. He listened quietly, then said something she would never forget. "Your body isn't just healing," he said. "It's learning to trust you again." That sentence stayed with her long after she left the clinic. Years of discomfort had made her feel like her body was working against her. But now, she was beginning to see something different. It wasn't the enemy. It was simply asking for care. As time went on, Margaret became someone who didn't just use dry brushing. She talked about it with others in her support group. She never claimed it was a cure for everything. She simply shared her experience. "It's not magic," she would say, "but it's gentle. And sometimes gentle is exactly what we need." Daniel often reminded his patients of something simple but powerful. Healing is not always loud. Sometimes it happens quietly, in small moments that build over time. For Margaret, those moments added up to something meaningful. She wasn't the same person she had been before her symptoms started, but she wasn't trapped anymore either. She had found a way to live more comfortably in her own body again, and that, to her, felt like freedom. In the end, what began as a simple brush in a quiet clinic became a daily reminder that the body, no matter its age, still has the capacity to respond, adapt, and gently restore balance when given the chance. Some journeys don't begin with a dramatic breakthrough. Some begin with something as small as a brush in your hand and the willingness to try once more. And the line Margaret often found herself thinking about, especially on difficult days, was this: small steps, big healing. The late afternoon sun was fading over the small suburban neighborhood in Florida, where Margaret now lived, casting long golden shadows across the kitchen floor. The same kitchen where she once struggled just to stand for more than a few minutes now felt different. Not because the room had changed, but because she had. It had been several months since she first learned about dry brushing from Daniel, her physical therapist. At first, it had felt almost too simple to matter. A soft brush, a few gentle strokes, and some breathing exercises. How could something so basic help a condition like lymphedema? That was the question she kept asking herself in the beginning. But life has a quiet way of answering questions through experience rather than explanation. Margaret had continued the routine not because she fully believed in it at first, but because Daniel had told her something that stayed in her mind. Don't judge the body's response too early. Give it time to speak. So she did. Every morning, before the world fully woke up, she would stand in her bathroom with soft light reflecting off the mirror. She would take the natural bristle brush in her hand, breathe in slowly, and begin again. Feet first, then legs, then arms, always upward, always gentle. At first, she had to remind herself not to rush. Her old habits were different. Quick movements, impatience, frustration when things didn't show immediate results. But dry brushing demanded something she had almost forgotten in her life: patience. And slowly, that patience started to reward her in quiet ways. The heaviness in her legs didn't disappear overnight, but it softened. The tight pressure in her arms, especially in the evenings, began to ease. She noticed that by midday she wasn't as fatigued as she used to be. These were not dramatic changes that would make headlines or impress skeptical doctors at first glance. But for Margaret, they were life-changing, because she knew her own body better than anyone else. One morning, while brushing her arms near the window, she paused. The sensation that used to feel strange now felt almost natural. Her skin no longer resisted the touch, it responded to it. There was a lightness, a kind of warmth that seemed to spread slowly outward after each session. She stood there quietly for a moment, realizing something she hadn't allowed herself to believe before. Her body was not stuck. It was moving again. That thought alone brought tears to her eyes. But Margaret's journey was not only about physical change, it was also about emotional healing, something Daniel had warned her about from the beginning. When the body starts to release, he had said, the mind often follows. She didn't fully understand that at first, but over time she noticed it. The anxiety she used to carry quietly in her chest began to soften. The constant worry about whether her condition would get worse started to fade into the background. Even her sleep improved. Nights that used to feel long and restless became calmer. It wasn't that her life became perfect. Far from it. There were still difficult days when swelling would return slightly or fatigue would remind her of her condition. But now, those days didn't define her anymore. She had something she didn't have before, a sense of control. Not control over everything, but control over something very important, her daily actions. And those actions were shaping her recovery. One Thursday morning, Margaret returned to Daniel's clinic for a routine follow-up. The familiar scent of clean linen and soft oils greeted her as she stepped inside. But this time, she didn't walk slowly or carefully like she used to. Her steps were steadier. Daniel noticed it immediately. "You're moving differently," he said with a slight smile. Margaret smiled back. "I feel different too." He gestured for her to sit. "Tell me what's changed." She paused, thinking carefully. "It's not one big change," she said. "It's small things. I can stand longer without discomfort. My swelling is less unpredictable. And I don't feel as heavy in my own body anymore." Daniel listened without interrupting. This was the kind of progress he valued most, not just physical measurements, but lived experience. He nodded slowly. That's exactly how lymphatic recovery often works. It's gradual. The system responds to consistency, not intensity. Margaret looked at him thoughtfully. "I used to think I needed something stronger, something faster." Daniel leaned back slightly. "Most people do, but the lymphatic system doesn't respond well to force. It responds to rhythm, movement, and support. Dry brushing is just one way to remind it how to flow again." He paused, then added, "But it only works if it becomes part of your life, not just something you try once in a while." Margaret understood that now better than ever. Later that week, something unexpected happened that made her realize how far she had come. She was grocery shopping with her daughter when they had to walk through a long aisle filled with items on both sides. Normally, that kind of slow walking used to make her legs ache quickly. She would often look for places to sit or lean, but this time she kept walking, step after step. And then she noticed something unusual. She wasn't thinking about her pain. She was thinking about the groceries. It was such a simple realization, but it hit her deeply. For months, even years, her attention had been constantly pulled toward discomfort. But now, for the first time in a long time, her mind was free enough to focus on something else. That evening, she sat down and quietly said to herself, "I'm not where I used to be." It wasn't a complaint. It was gratitude. As weeks passed, Margaret expanded her routine slightly, always under Daniel's guidance. Dry brushing remained the foundation, but she also added gentle walking after meals and simple breathing exercises before bed. None of it felt overwhelming. In fact, it felt natural, like rebuilding a relationship with her own body. There was one particular morning she would never forget. She had woken up earlier than usual. The house was silent, the world outside still half asleep. She stood in front of the mirror holding the brush, but instead of starting immediately, she paused. She looked at herself, not critically, not with frustration, but with recognition. "I'm still here," she whispered softly. And then she began her routine. That day, something felt different, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, grounded way. It was as if her body was no longer resisting the process. The strokes felt smoother, the flow more natural, even her breathing felt deeper. After finishing, she didn't rush. She stood quietly, letting the feeling settle. For the first time, she truly understood what Daniel had meant when he said, "Your body remembers how to heal when you give it the right signals." Later that afternoon, she called her granddaughter and went for a short walk in the park nearby. The sun was warm, the air soft. Children were playing in the distance. And for a moment, Margaret simply walked without thinking about her condition at all. That moment didn't last forever, but it didn't need to, because it reminded her of something important. She was still living her life, and slowly she was reclaiming it. By the end of that month, when she returned to the clinic again, Daniel didn't even ask detailed questions right away. He simply looked at her and said, "You've been consistent." Margaret nodded. "I finally understood what you meant." He smiled. "Good. Because now your body is doing what it was always designed to do." She sat there quietly, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. Not because everything was perfect, but because something inside her had finally started to flow again. And sometimes, that is all a person truly needs to begin healing. The early morning air in Oregon was cool and still, carrying a quiet that only exists before the world fully wakes up. Inside a small, warmly lit home, Margaret stood near her bathroom mirror, holding the same simple, natural bristle brush she had come to trust more than she ever expected. It had become a part of her life now, not as a treatment she occasionally tried, but as a daily rhythm, like drinking water or breathing deeply. Yet even after months of practice, she still respected it with a kind of humility. because she understood something now that she didn't understand in the beginning. Healing, for her, had not been a single event. It had been a slow return, a return to comfort, a return to confidence, a return to feeling like her body was not something she had to fight against, but something she could work with. But this morning was different. Not because something dramatic had changed overnight, but because today she was going to share what she had learned with someone else for the first time. Her younger sister, Ellen, had come to visit. Ellen had always been strong, independent, and skeptical about simple solutions. When Margaret first told her about dry brushing, Ellen had smiled politely but didn't hide her doubt. "A brush?" she had said. "That's what's helping you?" Margaret hadn't argued. She didn't need to. She had learned that experience speaks louder than explanation. Now, as Ellen stood in the hallway watching her, Margaret could see that same skepticism still sitting quietly in her expression. "So," Ellen said, crossing her arms, "this is what you do every morning?" Margaret smiled gently. "Yes." Ellen raised an eyebrow. "And you think this is why you feel better?" Margaret paused for a moment, then answered honestly, "I don't think it's the only reason, but I think it's part of why I started improving." That answer was not dramatic. It was not defensive. It was calm. And that calmness made Ellen curious in a way she hadn't expected. Margaret gestured toward a chair. "Come here. Let me show you how it's done properly." Ellen hesitated. "I'm not sure I need—" But Margaret gently interrupted. "Just watch first." And so Ellen watched. Margaret began the way she always did now, slow, intentional, and focused on awareness rather than force. She started at her feet, brushing upward in soft, steady strokes. The movement was simple, almost ordinary, yet there was something almost meditative about the way she did it. No rushing, no pressure, no frustration, just rhythm. "Always toward the heart," Margaret said softly as she demonstrated. "That's what Daniel taught me. You're not scrubbing the skin, you're encouraging flow." Ellen watched silently as Margaret moved up her legs, then her arms. Each stroke was light but purposeful. It wasn't about intensity. It was about direction. When Margaret finished, she set the brush down and looked at her sister. "That's it?" Ellen asked. Margaret nodded. "That's it." Ellen let out a small breath, half amused, half confused. "It looks too simple to do anything." Margaret smiled, not offended. She had been there once too. "Most things that help the body are simple. We just don't always trust simple things." That sentence lingered in the air, because it carried truth. Later that week, Ellen agreed, mostly out of curiosity, to try it for a few days while staying at Margaret's house. At first, she treated it like a small experiment, something to prove or disprove. She brushed quickly, without much thought, almost mechanically. But Margaret gently reminded her, "Slow down, your body is not in a hurry." So Ellen slowed down. And something unexpected happened. She began to notice sensations she hadn't paid attention to before. The warmth of her skin, the slight difference in texture, the subtle feeling of movement beneath the surface after brushing. It wasn't dramatic. There was no instant transformation. But there was awareness, and that awareness was new. On the third morning, Ellen sat down after brushing and said quietly, "It actually feels calming." Margaret nodded. "That's what I felt too." But what Ellen didn't realize yet was that the change wasn't just physical, it was also mental.